When configuring WCF security, you have a choice of a couple transfer modes. One transfer mode is transport, and that means that the underlying protocol will provide the transfer security for you. In transport security mode, you have point-to-point encryption. The other mode is message, and in message encryption, it does the encryption in the message itself as opposed to relying on the underlying protocol. The benefit of this is that you have full security throughout your intermediaries if you have multiple hops along the way. Now, if you only have a point-to-point communication, then transport security may be an attractive option. However, for the highest degree of security, especially if you have intermediaries, message will be your best choice. It's popular to host web services in IIS, so I'm going to show you the steps that you need to use IIS as your web service host. So the first thing you need to do is create a new website project in Visual Studio. After you have that site project, then you create a reference to the assembly that contains the web service, which is how you get to the web service types. Inside of the website, you get a .svc file generated, and so in that file you're going to change the service so that the type is the web service type that you want to expose through your website. After that's set up in Visual Studio, you go to IIS and locate a website. And then on that website, you can create a web application and give it the physical address of the website you just created. So I'll show you how to do that now. Here we have a project with the WCF web service. It has a contract, iWeather service with the get temperature operation in the transfer security namespace. Over here is the implementation of get temperature, same namespace but in the weather service type. What we want to do is host this web service in IIS. So the first thing we need to do is create a new website in Visual Studio. WCF service, and then I'm going to specify the location and say OK. So here's a new service. The first thing we need to do is reference the WCF service project because that's what we're going to be hosting. I'll add a reference, transfer security, OK. Now I'll build it. You can see the bin folder right here with those DLLs for the transfer security assemblies. And next I want to modify this service.svc file. This is what will be addressed by clients. So we have this service host declaration and a service attribute. We won't use the code behind, so I'll get rid of that now. But the service is the fully qualified name of the web service. Transfer security weather service. So I'll save that, and that's all it takes to set up a web service with Visual Studio. I can right click on this and say view in browser, and here in this directory listing we'll select service.svc, and here's the helper page that Visual Studio gives you when you reference a service. So that tells us it's running fine. So we have a website set up. Now let's add that website to IIS so that we can host it. So over here in default website, I'm going to right click, say add application, and give it an alias. Weather service site, and then we'll point to the location where that service is. Say OK, and then we have the service right there we can see what's in the service by looking at Content View. There's a service SVC and web.config at the root. The bin folder holds the DLLs. So this is the structure you want. Anytime you take a website from Visual Studio and put it anywhere on your file system and you want to host it in IIS, you need to maintain this structure with the SVC on top and the web.config, and then your bin that holds the DLLs. Now we can go ahead and test it here by right-clicking and saying Browse. And there's the helper page again. So now we know we have that service hosted. To use transport security, you'll need to set up SSL, and here are the steps to do it. First, go to IIS and find the node for the machine that you want to set up SSL on. Then select the icon for server certificates. You'll see a list of server certificates that are there, but click Create Self-Signed Certificate. This is for testing. Then you select Website and add a binding for HTTPS. Then you go to the application and set the SSL settings there. Now I'll show you how to do this. So I've already opened IIS so that I can add a SSL certificate to my website for transport security. So the first thing I need to do is select the node with my machine and then go to Server Certificates. I'll double click. And there's the list of certificates that are already on the machine. Now if you were starting this out by going to your certification authority, you would go to this Create Certificate Request, fill this information out, go to the wizard, and it will create a file for you. You would take that file and give it to your certification authority, and they would come back to you with a new certificate, a .cer file. At that time, you would go to Complete Certificate Request, give the location of the .cer and a friendly name, and then complete that wizard, and your certificate will show up in the list. Now, for testing purposes, we have this nice link over here, Create Self-Signed Certificate, and that's what we're going to use now. And so here I'm going to give it a name, and just click OK, and you'll see the certificate show up in the list. So now we have a certificate on the machine. Let's add a binding to the website. So I selected the website, and over on the action pane there's a bindings link. I click that and then click Add, select HTTPS, and then on the SSL certificate we select the certificate we just created. That's the test certificate. And then click OK. And there's the binding. I'll click Close. So I have a website with the bindings. Now I'll go to the application and configure its SSL. So I'll go over to SSL settings, double click. I could either click Require SSL for the whole site to require SSL, or I could just say Accept. And then when I move off of there, then it's going to ask me to save, and I'll say Yeah. So now I have a website that's configured with SSL. And if I go to Content View, right click on the SVC file and say Browse, then I'll get this window right here saying, oh okay, well I'm configured here and I get by with HTTP, but I can also go over here, since I've got SSL is allowed, and go HTTPS, and then I get this warning screen. That's because my certificate is self-signed. And then I say continue to this website and dismiss this, and then there's my helper screen again. So we've now been able to secure our site for transport security by adding an SSL certificate to the website in IIS. Now once you have a service and it's hosted in a website with SSL, you can configure security on it. And here's how to do it. You just add a service binding and set the security mode to transport. So there's the binding, security mode transport, and there you have it. Let's go do that and then build a client to consume that service. So here we have a WCF service and a website that hosts it, and we want to configure the service so that it supports transport mode security. To do this, I'm going to right click on web.config and go to edit WCF configuration. And the first thing I'll do is I'll create a new binding so that I can configure the transport level security. And I'll go into the net HTTP binding, and I'll give it a name. And over here on the security tab, instead of mode none, I'm going to change that to transport. So now we have a binding, and next we'll need an endpoint to add this to. So I'll create a new service, and on the service I'm going to create a new base address, and now in the endpoints I'll add a new endpoint, and that binding will be the net HTTP binding, and the contract will be, I'll go down in bin, here's the DLL for transfer security, and there's the contract. And I need to match up that binding configuration with the binding we just created. So that's that. I'll say File, Save, and let's go inspect that binding. There's the base address, and there's the binding, the configuration for that contract, and the configuration matches this transport binding for the security mode. Now what we want to do is add a client that can consume this service. So I'll say add new project, and it'll be a console app. Say OK. And what I'll do is I'm going to add a service reference. And the address I use will come from IIS. And here's the address that's being hosted by IIS. And I'll just paste it in there. Say go. There's my service. Give it a namespace. And now we have a reference for that service right there. Let's look at the bindings it created. So we have a couple basic HTTP bindings in there, and it's saying that we have transport mode security set up. So let me go to Program, and we will consume that service. Add the namespace, and then we'll need the name of the binding that we want. We want to use transport security secure mode, so we use a HTTPS address. So I'll get the name of that to use. And then we'll consume the service. And we'll give a message to the user. And we'll keep the console from shutting down before we've seen the message. And let's run that. Not yet. We have to set the client as the startup project and then run that. And there we have it. We are communicating with the service over HTTPS using transport mode security. In addition to transport security, there's another transfer security mode called message security. Message security is essentially encrypting the credentials of the message within the message itself, as opposed to relying on the underlying transport. There's a couple ways to configure message security. One is via API. Here's a quick example that shows how we can pass a parameter to the constructor of the binding. You can also use web.config to configure message security declaratively. And so there's a binding and the mode is set to message for the security mode. So I'm going to show you how to do this. Here I've already set up a service, and what I want to do is I want to show you how message security works. The first thing that I did is I set up this endpoint right here, and I made it a WSHTTP binding, and then added this bindings element up here, and I set the security mode to message. Now the WSHTTP binding already defaults to message, and so this is really redundant, but I put it there anyway because I'm going to show you the difference between having message security and not. So I'm going to run this project and pull up the test client. And on this get temperature method, I'm going to invoke it, and then we'll look at the XML generated. There's the request, and here's the response. And looking at the response, you're going to see a lot of encryption details in this message. See all of the encrypted data and so on. Now, let me shut that down. I'll go over and I'll turn this mode over to none. And then I'll run that. And then I'll run the test on that get temperature again and look at the XML generated, and notice that all of that encryption is gone because I turned it off via configuration by setting the mode to none. And you can see that the normal XML got sent and serialized in plain text. Next, I'll show you how to configure message transfer mode programmatically. For this, I'll create a new project to host the service. I'll give it a name. And then we need to reference a couple assemblies. One is the system.service model. And the other is the service itself. With those references, I can create an instance of service host. I'll pull in the namespace for system.service model. Give it a type of with or service. And pull in its namespace. Now I'm going to create a custom binding. And these bindings have a parameter for security mode. And notice that there's different security modes I can select. Transport, none, or transport with message credential. And the transport with message credential gives you the best of both worlds, where you can use transport mode security and encrypt your credentials in the message. But here we're using message. And all I need to do now is add a binding to an endpoint. There's a contract, and this is the binding we just created. And I'll give it an address. Now I'll open the host. Let the user know. And then keep the window open. Now I'll set that as my startup project. And press F5 to run to ensure that the host is running properly. And yes, it is. Now that I have a service hosted for message transfer security mode, I'm going to create a client to consume that, and I'm going to configure the client so that it can handle message transfer mode also. And so here I'll say add new project. It'll be a console app. So in this message client, I'm going to create a reference. And I'll first create a reference to the existing service. So that gives me the proxy. And I'm just going to go in here and change the address so that it'll point at the hosted service. And now what I'm going to do is create a proxy. And that proxy instance will be using this configured endpoint. But I'm going to customize it, and I'm going to use its binding that was pulled out of configuration. And I can get to the endpoint of the proxy and then to its binding. See how I can get to the address, binding, and contract? This is just another way to get there. And for this binding, I need to pull in the system.serviceModel namespace. And with the binding, I can get to the security mode and set that to message. So now I've programmatically configured the client for message security mode. And I'm going to use the proxy to call the service. And then I'll keep the window open. And build. That's a good build. Now what I need to do is make sure that the service and the client start up together. So I'll go to Solution, Set Startup Projects. Instead of just one project, I'm going to select multiple. And then I'm going to move up this host to make sure it starts before the client. Start the host and then start the client. And so that is my startup sequence, and I'll press F5, and here it is. The host is running in the background, and here we called the service through the host using message transfer mode security.